Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. But before we get into that final segment, we do come back to a comment yet again from Andre, who is asking a very, very tough question of me right now. Who are your top 5 quarterbacks in order? Well, here's the thing. This year has proven that any quarterback on any given Sunday can perform well across a very small sample size. So I can say that I can sit here and give you guys who have performed this season in terms of the small sample size we've seen in them and give that kind of top 5 from this season. But I'm going to give you my top 5 guys in terms of who I thought coming into the season would be the top guys. And I don't necessarily think it will change that much because these are all guys who I rely on week in, week out. But the top kind of has changed for me a little bit because of what I've seen from this season, but it's still kind of similar to what I would have said coming into this season, as you asked me a bit earlier. So, number 1 right now is actually Josh Allen. This was kind of bolstered by what I've seen from him so far, but at the end of the day, he's proving that losing Stephon Diggs does not matter. He's proving that team mentality always comes first. And he's just shining in this offense under Joe Brady. I'm still going to put Mahomes at number 2. He is, like he said himself, he's not playing his best football at this current moment, but he still adds so much value to that team. And he's worth at least 4 or 5 wins this Chiefs squad. Without him, I don't know how this Chiefs squad would look. Then I'm going to say Lamar Jackson, Just because of his dual threat ability, he's kind of in a similar situation to Mahomes where he's asked to do more in this offense. Maybe not to the extent that Mahomes is, but just because of his dual threat ability and his ability to keep this team competitive despite all the offensive line deficiencies they faced this year, I still think Jackson warrants a top 5 selection. This is where it's kind of going to get dicey a little bit. And number 4, I got to throw Hurts in there. And you can criticize me for this pick because of the turnovers, because of the decision making that kind of fall into his lap due to Sirianni. But I think that the reason why a lot of people love Hurts so much is because of the fact that, taking away all the offensive scheming and things of that nature in the world of football, Jalen Hurts, if you were to just offer him to someone as a guy who would kickstart your franchise without knowing about him or just want to take a flyer on him, he would pay dividends. If Sirianni, weren't necessarily quote-unquote holding him back as much, then I would say Jalen Hurts would potentially rival some of these top 3 guys. And the last guy, this is tough because as Tapter says, Purdy will rise, and maybe not as high as top 5. But the last guy I will take a lot of flack for. It's just that I believe in him with this offense. I believe in his capabilities in this offense. I got to go Jared Goff. Yes, based off these past 3 games, you can say that he should not be anywhere near the top 5. But there's just something about the style of play in Ben Johnson's offense that gives me hope in what he can be as the season progresses. We saw last year what he was in that offense for a full year. And this is just kind of the intricacies of Ben Johnson's offense coming into play as well, where they can be confident if Jared Goff does not play up to snuff in running the football. But when he does, look for him to put up big numbers and warrant that top 5 selection. That's my personal top 5. Ultimately, it's not the best, I know, but it's the one that I feel like is most comprehensive to me at this current point, irregardless of what we've seen from all the quarterbacks in the league thus far. But I do want to take a little bit of a respite from the NFL and transition to my last segment, as Tap to Learn says CJ Stroud belongs up there. Well, the thing about CJ Stroud, right, is that you kind of feel like you know his strengths are and you know how confident he feels in that DeMeco Ryans-led team, but then you know that his weaknesses are really, really flawed weaknesses once you know he plays a competent defense. So I love CJ Stroud, but his weaknesses are so glaring when you see them, which albeit they are rare, but when you do see them, they are very, very glaring in terms of some other guys here, because the other guys on that list I feel like can make up for the errors they can make in that offense, and also because their offenses are so strong that, any one of them at any given time can mitigate for any mistakes. Whereas CJ Stroud, yes, he has one of the best teams in the league. It's just that I'm not confident in placing him amongst players who can more easily mitigate for their mistakes and not get completely overwhelmed by certain teams. So I love CJ Stroud, respect him, but maybe he's on the periphery right now. But I do want to get into the world of college football, as much as I appreciate all these comments and much as I appreciate all these debates. Talk about some of the interesting games in terms of fantasy implications there. Let's start off with perhaps the biggest game of the weekend, perhaps in all of sports. Yes, we talked a lot about the NFL games that will matter this week, but this game perhaps is the marquee matchup across any sport this weekend, and that is Georgia-Alabama. Actually, I do have Illinois-Penn State, but we will skip that for this game's purpose. I think that this game does take precedence over Illinois-Penn State for as much fun as that game's going to be for now. Really quickly, I'm going to go through this. We only have about 4 minutes left from the show. I think that this game is really going to come down to which QB steps up. More importantly, which quarterback performs better at their specific trait level than the other guy, if that makes sense. For Carson Beck, is just staying on schedule. He's not, from a fantasy perspective, the sexiest option for you out there, but he's just a timely, opportunistic guy who's going to stay on schedule. In terms of the weapons that UGA has, they really haven't necessarily stepped up, but that could lead to their success in this game, because Alabama really doesn't know that much about who could be the biggest weapon for UGA in this game. It could be Dominic Lovett, it could be Dylan Bell, it could be their running back Trevor Etienne. It could be any of those guys, and that could play into, in terms of a fantasy perspective, a lot of different options you could be looking at. But if Carson Beck just stays in schedule, that will be the best possible story for Georgia. In terms of Jalen Milroe, if you just took this matchup face value and didn't necessarily care about anyone else and just said, pick these two quarterbacks, it would be Jalen Milroe from a fantasy perspective, just because of the explosiveness he offers at the QB position. But explosive plays don't necessarily translate to on-field success that much, because as much as they would love to keep that as an aspect of their offense, Georgia's defense is for real. As much as, their offensive deficiencies might come through in this game, this Georgia defense is very good at limiting the explosive play. And yes, Jalen Milroe is a very special kind of quarterback. He's done this before. That was under Nick Saban, though. And I feel like a lot of different weapons on Alabama can step up in this game, whether it be J.M. Miller, whether it be Ryan Williams, who's shown his explosiveness as a true freshman, one of the younger players in college football, mind you. I think that overall, this team can't necessarily hope and pray that every single drive is going to end in explosive play down the field. Because as much as that would be a more exciting kind of aspect of the game, because it could open the game up more, you still have to beat a Georgia team that's going to want to control the football more than you. You have to consider that as well, because you don't necessarily want this game turning into a track meet, although it could play into your favor if you're Alabama. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about the QBs in this game. I think that if you're a fantasy football, college football especially enthusiast, this game is really going to speak to two different kind of quarterbacking philosophies. So look to that game. But let's go back to the Illinois-Penn State game for a little bit of time. It's going to be defense versus offense. It's going to be Drew Aller, who's been one of the more impressive QBs in the nation thus far under that new offensive scheme with Andy Kotelnicki at the helm. I think that, Illinois' defense is good enough to frustrate Penn State's offense for a nice period of time, but it's just that Penn State's offense has some of the best weapons in the game, especially in terms of a fantasy perspective as well. Omari Evans has really stepped up. Harrison Wallace. I really like the two-back tandem in Nicholas Singleton and Keyshawn Allen. Really haven't seen a lot of them this year, but that's just going to show how deep this offense has become. On the Illinois side of things, I think that this offense, it has some special players. Luke Altmaier has looked really good this year. Not necessarily asked to do too much in this offense, but I think that it just needs to stay on schedule. I like Caden Fagan in this game, can play a big role at the running back position. Ultimately, the marquee matchup for this game is defense versus offense. And the last game here, I kind of want to touch on before we have to end the show, is OK State, Kansas State. Big game in terms of the Big 12, in terms of which of these teams can emerge as a title contender to rival Utah in the Big 12. And a big question in terms of fantasy is whether or not, Ollie Gordon is still an RB1, but it's also about can, the players on both of these squads that are expected to step up really step up as well. Alan Bowman should have an interesting kind of game because he's not someone who I would rely upon as a fantasy QB in college football. And then on the other side of things, can Avery Johnson kind of wipe away the memories of that BYU game quickly enough to go into this game and be ready to be in attack mode for this Kansas State offense? But Ollie Gordon is a big question as well because he's had a slow start and I want to see more of him. But let me know what you think in the comments. That will just about do it for this show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your great comments. Keep them coming for next week's shows as well to make this show as interactive and exciting as possible. But also consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. But without further ado, I'm going to end the show right about here, but thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, starting on Monday. But other than that, I am out.